my name is Hana Hill. I'm a PhD researcher at the UEA, and I'm currently looking at the works and networks of the writer and poet Amelia Opie, who's an important literary figurehead from this fine city. And she's also the subject of this distinctive portrait. Through my research, I've actually come to learn about a whole web of influential female writers and philosophers who, in their own unique ways, navigated what was a contentious time in history and made a name for themselves when the divide between the public and the private sphere was limiting roles for women throughout Britain. My talk today will be on higher education for women in the 18th century, the long 18th century, I should say. And that period covers anywhere from the late 1660s to the early 1830s. Now, the first college for women didn't open until 1849, so we might assume that higher education was non-existent for women before this date. While this is true in a strictly formal sense, it doesn't tell the whole story. And there are many examples of bold, intelligent, savvy women who were able to carve out a continuing education for themselves, often in the face of extreme institutional prejudice. Many of these women, Opie included, belonged to an important intellectual network within Norwich itself, famously called the City of Sedition around this time. Norwich and her residents were famed for valiantly fighting the status quo and championing rational dissent in every sphere of life. Before I go on, I'd just like to talk a little bit about this portrait that I've included. I'm so sorry, I've gone for style over substance in the design of this slide, and half of it is a bit obscure to you now. But for anyone interested, the original actually hangs in the Norwich Castle Art Gallery. And it's quite something to see. This was painted by Amelia Opie's husband, John Opie, who was a famous Cornish painter. And what's really interesting about this portrait is that it wasn't commonplace to paint a dual subject of this with two forms of the same model side by side. I think the choice reflects not only the duality inherent in the model herself, something which John Opie would have been tenderly aware of, but also the dual forms, or I might say the multiple forms of femininity that coexisted in the 18th century. On the one hand, you have the demure, docile woman, embellished with an ornamental education, whom the private sphere was expected to satisfy. On the other hand, you have the assertive, ambitious woman, whose fierce desire to learn and to be an active part of public life couldn't be contained despite numerous attempts by church and government and the press to do so. Importantly, these two forms of femininity often did exist within the same subject. So we might ask what we understand by the term education today. And because it's important to contextualize it, to think of what 18th century society would have understood by it and its purpose. It would have been connected to the concepts of virtue and improvement back then, rather than the strictly scholarly connotations it has today. You can tell which parts I've memorized. I'll briefly be looking at the early education of young men and women. And I'd like to stress this will be chiefly looking at people of means, gentlemen's children, who made up the literate society of fashionable people. And this is strictly because it's from their letters that I'm getting this evidence. So unfortunately, there is a bias there that we will need to be aware of. And the differences in the early part of their education are already apparent, but this again wasn't universal. There are many instances of young men and women being taught in exactly the same way in the early part of their studies, and importantly, of daughters arguing to be taught alongside their brothers. The agency of women was, as I've come to learn, an important factor throughout their pedagogy and helped to ensure these individuals' successes. I'll be mainly focusing on what happened when women left their early schooling, what options might have been open to them. There were few routes into the workforce, but this didn't mean that women couldn't garner a public role, not just in attending parties and theatres and social gatherings, all very public activities that enjoyed an eruption at the turn of the 18th century, the likes of which hadn't been seen before. But by attending and actively participating in political rallies, mixed intellectual salons, writing plays for the theatre, poetry and prose for publication, often very politically charged pieces that appeared in rather radical publications, such as Norwich's own The Cabinet, which only ran for 3 volumes in 1785 because it was considered too dangerous. Sorry. So, yes, so so I'll be introducing some of the key names and networks within this debate, and I'll be focusing on the prominent Unitarian families around Norwich. I'll be looking also closely at the evidence from the letters, which complicates notions, perceived notions of the day about female education, particularly in the role of fathers who, far from being totally absent in their daughter's education, actually often provided the key that would open the door to public opportunity. And this is because of their membership to their own literary, philanthropic and political groups. We will see how women networked their way into intellectual debate that enriched their mind, promoted their talents, and harnessed their political agency, often to far-reaching historical significance. I'd like to conclude today by reading a part of a poem by celebrated writer, activist, and school teacher Anna Letitia Barbauld to her brother, Dr. John Aiken, which on the surface of it, while apparently lamenting the subjugated condition of women, contemporary women, in fact, by its beautiful eloquence, enduring fame, and the reputation of its trailblazing author, tells rather a different story. So here we have 2 definitions of education taken from the Oxford English Dictionary, with the bottom one being how we understand the word today. So by the late 18th century, education had already come to mean organized teaching and instruction, which makes sense because this coincided with the introduction of more formal schooling throughout Britain for both girls as well as boys. But this didn't specify a strictly scholarly curriculum, but one that would accomplish all the tasks set out by the pre-18th century meaning, which was literally to rear or bring up children to maturity. This meant to care for, nourish, and educate, with this nourishment prescribed for a child's emotional and spiritual, as well as their intellectual maturity. As the first definition here suggests, it was considered just as important to form character and shape manners and behavior as it was to impart knowledge. So what did this mean for the curriculum? And I use that word very informally, of the 18th century. And what did those defending female education have to defend? So I mentioned that the first women's college opened in 1849. In fact, it was much later than this that women were allowed to sit university examinations, and later still that they were allowed to be awarded degrees on the same terms as men. Nevertheless, the first college was called Bedford College, and still very much going today, although now it's known by the combined name of Royal Holloway and Bedford New College. The motto for this university is Esse quam videri, which means to be rather than to seem. I think the really interesting thing about this motto, especially considering the university's history, is how well it expresses one of the central arguments surrounding education in the 18th century, particularly female education. So the 18th century philosopher John Locke, in his work, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, argued that it was far more important to promote a child's virtue and innocence than, in this particular example, to teach them a little Greek and Latin. In other words, it was more important that they be robustly educated rather than seem to be so. Amelia Opie and her contemporaries also nurtured this view. For example, in Opie's novel Temper, she tackles this exact debate. In it, she states, to watch over the temper of a child, ameliorate it by salutary or proper indulgence, or control it by salutary restraints, is far, far more necessary to its future welfare than to reprove a fault in grammar or to correct an exercise. One of Locke's most famous supporters was the feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, staunch champion of female education throughout her life. In her first important work, the essay Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, which was meant very much to be an addendum to Locke's own work, she argues against the incompleteness of current educational practices. She speaks of exterior accomplishments, which refer to all those accomplishments which merely render the person attractive, and those half-learnt ones which do not improve the mind. A little learning of any kind is a dangerous thing, she quotes, and so far from making a person pleasing, it has the contrary effect. She does add that these accomplishments are not to be despised if the acquiring of them does not satisfy the possessors and prevent their cultivating the more important ones. The implication throughout is her desire for a continuing education for all women, for women not to be satisfied with what they've managed to string together in childhood. So what exactly were these exterior accomplishments? The education for girls can be summarized as intended partly to occupy the girl's mind, partly to attract the men, and in the last resort to earn a living by. This curriculum likely included English, French, sewing, music, and drawing. The key factor was that it was intended as a superficial education, or rather often called an ornamental one only. This certainly seems to have been the case for Amelia Opie and her contemporaries. In introducing their edition of her collected poetry, Shelley King and John Pierce state that, like many of her generation, Opie received little formal education beyond the accomplishments expected of women of her class. Studying French with the Reverend John Bruckner, minister of the Dutch Church in Norwich, music with Michael Sharp, who'd once played principal oboe at Covent Garden, and dancing with Mr. Christian. Later, she studied drawing with Mrs. Edward Beetham in London. Of Opie's personal views on her education, not much is known, but there is a telling passage from a letter that she composed to Susanna Taylor in 1800. Taylor was a close friend of Opie's and often acted as a surrogate maternal figure for her, and she was heavily involved in the Norwich Unitarian network. In this letter, Opie recollects, "When I now look at Mr. Bruckner's black cap, my memory gets astride on the tassel of it, and off she gallops at a very pleasant rate. Wooden desks, green bags, blotted books, inked hands, faces, and gowns rise in array before me." She goes on to say that, "I must own the most welcome objects that the hooves of my memory's hobby horse kick up are the great bees or bonds on my exercises." I'm internally cheering because that's a really hard sentence to say aloud. So basically, by her own admission, however, it is more the emotional aspects of these memories that resonates with her, rather than the usefulness of these lessons. For example, later on in the same correspondence, she says, "The older I grow, the more tenderly I cling to the scenes and recollections and companions of my early hours." Her choice of metaphor here, my memory's hobby horse, may also indicate her real views about the purpose of this schooling. The word hobby had, by 1816, come to refer to an innocuous pursuit to which a person is devoted out of proportion to its real significance. The word hobby horse was before this time used in its place, and the pastime of riding a toy horse signified a favorite occupation pursued merely for the amusement or interest that it affords. Now, Opie clearly relished the experience of her early schooling, but it's important that she declared in a dedication written a year after this correspondence that whatever of cultivation her mind received was owing to the indulgence of her father, whom from the age of 15, she accompanied on excursions for both business and pleasure. It would have been these very excursions and the connections that they encouraged, which were in fact vital to her continuing study. There wasn't always a strict gender divide in early education, however. Opie's friend Anna Letitia Barbauld, for example, is said to have successfully pleaded with her father to teach her Latin. In a poem she addressed to her brother as an adult, it's revealed the particularly egalitarian approach to their joint education. She writes, "Those hours are now no more which smiling flew, and the same studies saw us both pursue." Though she writes later in the poem that fate assigned her and her brother to very different roles in life, to her it was key that as children they were encouraged to pursue the same studies together. Opie herself mocks the conservative view on joint education in her novel Temper.
She writes of the great progress which the story's heroine, Emma, had made in the study of Latin and even of Greek. She goes on to say that Emma's tutor had wisely considered that it was the ostentatious display of learning in a woman and not the learning itself that was to be objected to, and telling Emma that all he required of her was a promise never to quote a Latin saying, he tried to make her as good a classic scholar as her male counterpart. Women were luckily equipped to circumnavigate these objections to the ostentatious display of learning, and this was as much to do with their own agency as it was with the progressive attitudes of the people they engaged to enable them. I thought it was interesting, given that I would label now what women employed in the 18th century to expand their minds and opportunities as networking, that the word itself was not actually used the way we understand it today before 1980. A little further research led me to this advice book where it's thought to have first appeared. I thought the blurb here was absolutely key, so I'm going to just read a little bit of that out. Networking through individual contacts and professional organisations became an important technique for women to get career advice and make connections. Such contacts also helped offset the competitive advantage men often enjoyed through their old boy network. Almost 2 centuries earlier, we have evidence that women used this exact technique to resounding personal and professional success.
As Barbauld put it, the best way for women to acquire knowledge was through conversation. This beautiful portrait depicts Barbauld, along with a host of other women who, through their own intricate networks, are today celebrated alongside their male peers as geniuses in their respective field. We have, just briefly, from left to right, Elizabeth Carter, a poet and formidable translator. Anna Letitia Barbauld is next to her with her arm outstretched. We then have the artist Anna Kaufman, one of the founding members of the Royal Academy in London. Then we have in the middle Elizabeth Ann Sheridan, a famous singer, poet, and behind-the-scenes politician. Then celebrated female historian Catherine Macaulay, whose own letters on education inspired Wollstonecraft's later works. Above, we have Hannah More, a conservative feminist who, though appearing to endorse the strict separation of male and female roles, nevertheless campaigned for better education for women. Then we have Elizabeth Montagu, an aristocratic hostess who championed intellectual debate on equal terms between men and women. Next to her, Elizabeth Griffith, actress and author, and finally Charlotte Lennox, celebrated author of The Female Quixote. Most of these women were blue stockings, so called for the casual clothing worn by male members of the group. This was an intellectually ambitious set of men and women who enjoyed lively, instructive repartee at fashionable London salons or assemblies, chiefly hosted by female members of the group, whose role it was to keep the conversation flowing. No sooner had the term blue stocking been coined, unfortunately, that critics decided to use it in a derogatory sense. And it came to refer to women who affected to have literary tastes with no real substance behind them, i.e. women who seemed rather than were intellectual. Nevertheless, these salons set the stage for, as Barbauld put it, acquiring knowledge through conversation. Scholars today understand the literary salon to have been a fertile context for female education. And though the Blue Stocking Network is perhaps one of the most famous, it was by no means the only such arrangement for promising female minds. Norwich had her own prolific examples. OP dedicated her first named work, The Father and the Daughter, a novel, to her own father, writing, "To you I owe whatever of cultivation my mind has received." Now, she nurtured a tender affection for her father throughout her life, particularly after losing her mother at the age of 15. But here, this dedication isn't only inspired by filial duty, but accurately attributes the early beginnings of her higher education to him. It was through him that she made some of the most enduring and instructive connections of her literary career, particularly political philosopher William Godwin, the Unitarians Susanna Taylor and her husband John, and the Gurneys, a prominent Quaker family from Norwich. Of these, the Unitarian connections were perhaps the most unique in their views on female participation, and I'm now going to talk a little bit about them. So the Unitarians were a dissenting religious group that in Norwich worshipped at the Octagon Chapel. Scholars have noted that since the 1790s, leading members of the Unitarians had often advanced and practiced progressive attitudes in female education, and thus, by influence and example, helped pave the way for future developments. In his introduction to the history of the Octagon Chapel, the Reverend J. Bruckner spoke of the rise and progress of a body of Christians possessing perfectly unfettered freedom of inquiry, this referring to both the male and female members of the congregation.
We have, from the works and letters of some of the key female members of this network, evidence of their commitment to this freedom of inquiry. I've listed a number of these names here. What's particularly clear from these examples is the strength of the individual desire for participation and improvement. These women did not simply bear the deficiencies of their education, but campaigned for their own rights and the rights of their peers. Lucy Aiken was the niece of Barbauld, whose social visits with female friends as a young woman strengthened her support for educational reform. Her first major work, Epistles on Women, published when she was 29, argued for, if not total equality, at least an equality of education between the sexes. She writes, towards the end of Epistle 4, "Rise, shall he cry, O woman, rise, be free. My life's associate, now partake with me. Rouse thy keen energies, expand thy soul, and see and feel and comprehend the whole. My deepest thoughts intelligent divide, when right confirm me, and when erring guide." In addressing the scenes of domestic life and championing this equal divide of intelligence between husband and wife, she touches on some of the frustrations that many 18th century individuals were already recognising. For example, in a letter to esteemed Norwich clergyman, the Reverend William Gunn, one of his friends complains of this exact point, writing, "In the instance of my wife, many little things that I used to consider as indifferent I now look upon very differently, and this sometimes has occasioned little awkward heats and arguments. I think it is the defect of education and strength of prejudice in her. She may think it want of temper in me." Whatever the true reason for these domestic heats, as he put it, the very real discrepancy in the education of husband and wife often caused very real issues for everyday people. Fortunately, scenes like this can be contrasted with the flow of rational ideas that stemmed from mixed salons and political lectures, the likes of which Norwich had by now become famous for. As scholar Harriet Guest noted, the level of political engagement and free thought among dissenters in Norwich was exceptional, and women's participation in public life was encouraged. Sisters Anne and Annabel Plumptre, close childhood friends of Opie, both took a keen interest in local and parliamentary politics, and, not content with watching from the sidelines, used their connections to become actively involved in rallies. Anne Plumptre befriended the classicist and poet George Dyer, for example, one of the many radical literary acquaintances she made, who not only offered her advice on her writing and getting it published, but also shared her passion for politics. In one of her letters to him, Plumptre wrote about her time spent with radical politician John Thelwall, a dangerous orator famed for his impassioned speeches and unfortunately the protests that these attracted. She writes of being charmed with Thelwall, and that his manner renders him no less delightful in private society than his transcendent powers of oratory render him in the tribune. She goes on, "All I could do in promoting attendance on his lectures I have done, both for his sake and for the sake of his hearers, who, if they are anything more animated than blocks, cannot fail, I think, to be improved by what they hear." From this, we can gather that not only did Anne Plumptre gain the opportunity to hear and to be improved, i.e. instructed, educated, by the oratory of her hero, and even to speak with him enough in private society to be charmed by his manners, but she also took an active role in marketing his success. acting as the promoter of his lectures and securing him a proper audience. This sort of role was often mirrored by the salonières, hostesses who gathered an assembly of intellectually interesting people at their homes. Susanna Taylor was a notable example of one of these. Elizabeth Martineau, mother of celebrated social theorist Harriet Martineau, was another. She wrote, following one of her assemblies, to Susanna Taylor's husband, John, "My husband raised an alarm in my mind last Sunday by suggesting that what I said relative to my father might possibly put some restraint upon your conversation. Now this would hurt me beyond measure, as freedom of sentiment is the great delight of our Sunday night meetings." She went on, "Talk as usual, for it would give me real concern to have a single idea of yours suppressed, or to have it come forth in any surreptitious garb. Sincerity and no disguise in the presence of her who can admire without envy and love without jealousy of superior talents. The suggestion is that men, in the presence of women, may often have felt the need to withhold some of their ideas in the name of politeness. As Norwich's radical periodical The Cabinet once poetically declared, "Conversation, whose chemic power extracts from the ore its hidden treasure deposited in the mind, is seldom allowed to women its natural and potent operation." To stress the importance of freedom of sentiment, therefore, was not only necessary in helping guests to feel welcome and secure, but absolutely crucial in promoting that instructive debate so beneficial to an assembly's female attendees. The last person I would like to talk about here is Anna Enfield. Of all these names on the list, she is perhaps the most obscure, but as an example of an ordinary middle-class girl from a respectable Unitarian family, the letters exchanged between her and her father, William Enfield, a former Octagon Chapel minister, offer much insight into the methods that young women employed to further their education. The following letter neatly encapsulates and expands on many of the points I've brought up in this presentation, and I'd like to just examine part of this charming exchange between a devoted father and his curious, intelligent young daughter. William Enfield wrote this letter when Anna would have been 16 years old, and away on a visit to the Aikins at Great Yarmouth, where she was spending time with friends, including Amelia Opie, then called Alderson, and another young lady referred to as Miss M. Enfield first recalls the constant care that Anna's mother took in her education, and boasts of Anna's progress in knowledge. This is in keeping so far with the traditional role of mothers as educators. However, his tender display of emotion, writing with tears of his regrets at neglecting her, suggests the importance he bestowed on paternal involvement, even in his daughter's studies. Though complimenting her on her achievements thus far, he agrees that much yet needs to be done. Though Anna would have by now left any relevant schooling, her education had only just begun. And where other girls may sit down contented with their stock of ideas, Enfield is clear that he expects his daughter to cultivate further study and aspire after distinction. Enfield writes, "As soon as you return to the spot which I rejoice to hear you call your Dulce Domum, for a better reason than because it shows you can quote Latin, I will meet you with a plan of study." Instead of quoting Latin purely in order to seem learned, Anna's father rejoices that she does so from better motives. The plan for furthering their education, we are to understand, was entirely Anna's, designed in conjunction with her new friend. She appears to have engaged her learned father purely from a consciousness that she and her friend would be able to benefit from his extensive knowledge. As Enfield writes, the generous emulation of friends, whose minds are superior to every taint of envy, is a fruitful source of improvement. And Anna's friend is, by proxy, here profiting from this new connection and the doors it might open for her. Enfield assures his daughter he will give all the assistance in his power, both in her little plan and in any other pursuit that comes within the circle of his studies. Though it may indeed have been fortunate that Anna Enfield had a near relation who was able to devote his time and knowledge to their continued education, it is also key that this social visit provided an opportunity for these young women to canvass their hopes and desires for improvement, and make detailed plans that they found the means to execute. As Enfield concludes in his letter, the manner in which Anna spent her time was perfectly satisfactory, and she cannot but have passed it agreeably as well as profitably in the house of their dear friends. Despite institutional attempts to stifle their early education with ornamental studies and entirely to neglect it beyond their childhood, women were able to harness the power of networks to enter into spheres of life that they would have been, if not for their own efforts, poorly equipped to navigate. They made use of well-informed family members, radical political circles, progressive literary coteries, and, importantly, the assistance of like-minded women to open the doors towards intellectual debate and lay the foundations for women's suffrage mere decades in the future. I'd just like to end with part of a poem by Anna Letitia Barbauld to her brother, with whom she shared her fondest years while studying together as children. An interesting fact to keep in mind while I'm reading this is that exactly 100 years following its composition, the University of London became the first institution to accept female candidates for examination. And in the summer of that academic year, 9 young women sat this exam. 10 years later still, women were finally admitted to read the same degrees as men, on equal terms, for the first time in British history. Those hours are now no more which smiling flew, and the same studies saw us both pursue. Our path divides. To thee fair fate assigned the nobler labours of a manly mind, while mine more humble works and lower cares, less shining toils and meaner praises shares. Yet, sure in different moulds they were not cast, nor stamped with separate sentiments and taste. But hush, my heart, nor strive to soar too high, nor for the tree of knowledge vainly sigh. Check the fond love of science and of fame, a bright, but a too devouring flame. Content remain within thy bounded sphere, for fancy blooms, the virtues flourish there.